Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Tyron. I use she, her pronouns, and I am from CICMH, the Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health. I'm the research and knowledge lead there. Before we begin, I do want to begin with a land acknowledgement. I know we are in a virtual session today, but we're joining in from the ancestral lands of many Indigenous communities. I am currently in Toronto, Treaty 13 territory, and the home of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Wendat peoples, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa, and the people who may still be unrecorded. As a settler myself, it is my duty to acknowledge the effects of colonialism that we still see today, the ways I may be participating in it, and the ways I can actively push back against it. As we go through this webinar, I want you to think about how you might be able to support Indigenous students and colleagues in your role to promote a whole campus approach to health and wellness, but also to be an active participant in the reconciliation process. So this can look like participating in education on Indigenous peoples, their cultures, language, arts, worldviews, and supporting organizations that help Indigenous communities. Before we turn it over to our lovely speakers here, I do want to go over a few housekeeping. Closed captioning is at the bottom of the screen. If you'd like to turn it on, you're welcome to turn it on. There is a chat function for discussions and thoughts and reactions. Please keep it respectful and feel free to share your thoughts, questions. But if you'd like to go through a formal questioning process at the end, there is a Q&A function at the bottom where you can submit questions directly to the panelists, and we are able to see those more clearly instead of the chat. The recording will be available on our website at the end of the day, so if you have to leave at the middle of it, no worries. I hope you have a great time this morning, and I will turn it over to our folks to introduce themselves and to begin.
Yeah, thank you very much. Anin Bojo, Anjeni Indigenous Gawin and Dodamisi. Mamonene Kwayendao, Panatangushin and Donjba, Minwa Nogajiwanong and Dada. So hello, my name is Anjeni Lovelady. I am a mixed race Algonquin and Anishinaabe, British and Scottish person. My family historically was tied to Pikwakanagan Algonquin First Nation in the Ottawa Valley. But I did grow up on the shores of Georgian Bay in Penetanguishene, and now have lived here in Peterborough or Nogajiwanong for about 8 years. So between both places, they're both covered under the Williams Treaty. Yeah, I am the project coordinator for the First Peoples House of Learning here at Trent University. So my role is to engage with community partners, with various departments on campus, municipalities, mental health organizations, pretty much everyone who is looking for just some education, some learning on the history of this nation and how it's affected Indigenous people, and then how we can move forward in a good way. And I will turn it over to my director, Dawn.
Ani Bojo, Wabmimi Dijnakas, Wikwem Kong Donjaba, Anishinaabekwe, and Dao Ngojiwanong Indida. So good morning, everybody. I'm Dawn Lavell Harvard. My traditional name in my language is Wabmimi, which means white dove. We actually, everyone in our department here knows that I didn't know I had an English name until I was 13. So that's what we now call my CRA name, because that's really the only ones that still use the English name. And I'm from the Wikwemikong First Nation on Manitoulin Island. So as a member of the Anishinaabe Nation, I am also a guest here on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas in this particular area. Our region on Manitoulin is Odawa and Ojibwe from my community and Potawatomi. So I too am a guest here, and I just want to acknowledge, I don't want to simply acknowledge the privilege to have the ability to live and work here on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Mississaugas, but I want to make sure that I take the moment to acknowledge that my ability to be here has come at a great cost to the Mississauga peoples. I want to take a moment to acknowledge that. So thank you all very much for coming here today.
So just a little bit of background about who we are as First Peoples House of Learning. So we are the Indigenous Student Support Department here at Trent University. So what we do all the way from admissions, so those young high schoolers or sometimes mature students who've gone on to do work and then have wanted to come back to do some education. We help them all the way from admissions through to graduation and beyond. So everything from helping them find housing, helping them access grants and scholarships that they can use to fund their studies. We have a Indigenous student therapist here on campus who is culturally trained. So she is Indigenous and she understands the histories that these students bring when they come here that might affect them differently from other students who are working here on campus. Dawn, anything you'd like to add there?
I think one of the things, and this is the importance of when we move into the just get over it, very often, as I'm sure everybody realizes, there's these conversations about sort of staying in your lane within the academy. There's the academic side of the house and the student support side of the house. But here at the First Peoples House, we realize that our role in terms of supporting Indigenous students requires that we kind of be those terrible drivers all over everybody's lanes, because what we do intersects with so many parts of the academy. So we have, not only are we working to create safer spaces for Indigenous students, here in our particular areas, but simultaneously working to make sure that the entire institution and the larger community in this region become safer, become more inclusive and accepting, so that ideally, eventually, we don't have to rely as much on small pockets of safety, but creating wider systemic change. And I think that's part of our larger goal.
Yeah, so as Mimi touched on, part of our goals with educating other departments on campus, so faculty, IT, the facilities folks, so the folks who are, managing the university on a day-to-day basis, teacher candidates, social work students, everybody across campus is doing this learning so that when they go on into their own jobs, those teacher candidates, those social work students, when they graduate and they move on into their own fields, no matter where they go, they have that history in the back of their mind, so they know how to engage with, Indigenous coworkers, colleagues, clients who might be coming through their doors, depending on the lands that they're working on. How can they engage with that history in a positive way through their profession? In addition to that, when we train people like IT staff, when we train faculty and other student support staff, now when they engage with Indigenous students, they understand a little bit more why those students might be, a little wary of certain people, or why they might be upset by certain things that other students aren't upset by. So our goal with this training is not to leave people in a state of guilt, not a place of shame, but rather to empower them to understand this history, understand the pain that was caused by this history, but to look forward and want to work together, want to build something new and something positive. So we named this exercise the Just Get Over It, because this is a sentiment that we have heard many, many times as Indigenous people. Residential schools happened in the past. The 60s scoop happened in the past. Why can't you just get over it? Why can't you let it go? And the topics that we talk about in this exercise, we create a timeline of the Indian Act, residential schools, enfranchisement, the 60s scoop, the Millennium Scoop, gender discrimination and how it unfairly targeted women, missing and murdered Indigenous women, Two-Spirit people and how they've been erased from that history. All of these things that we kind of hear about separately, whether it's in the classroom or in the news or, wherever we hear about this history, we always hear about it in chunks separately. And so it creates this understanding that all of this happened in the past, happened a long time ago. You know, it sucks that residential school happened, but why are we still talking about it? Why do we need to still be stuck here? Why are we talking about this still? When we create this timeline, when we put all of these things together and we link them, we can see that that legacy of pain didn't just stop, 200 years ago, 100 years ago, even 50 years ago. The last residential school closed in 1996, right? There's folks in my generation who were, in elementary school, going to high school when there were still students in residential schools. And I'm not that old. I'm only 25. So, there's a lot of missing pieces in that history that we try to bridge with the Just Get Over It exercise. Mimi, I'll pass it to you.
So when we developed the Just Get Over It, it was at a time when everybody had just gone into COVID. We were trying to find a way to we had all kinds of experiential activities that we did. I'm sure people have done the Kairos blanket exercise. But as everybody moved into COVID, we were trying to find a way to still be engaging, to still be able to, share this important history of colonization. As even when we talk about, this is the story of how we went from strong independent nations, and they were in fact nations that covered all of the land, how we went from that, through that process of nation to nation treaties, but ended up finding ourselves, we're all together in a situation now where Indigenous peoples, First Nations, have less than 0.5, it's around 0.3% of our original lands as our territories now, and the impact that has on our peoples, on our ability to survive when you have been reduced to 0.3% of your original territories. So being able to take people through that timeline, having them see, this process, and helping to dispel, many of those myths, these notions that this was the Indian Wars, that you people lost the war, and so you have to follow the rules and speak the language of the people that conquered you. And be able to actually say, like, no, those are the stories of Walt Disney and John Wayne movies, that the actual history here in Canada, we need to teach the real history of coming together nation to nation, understanding that process so we can understand how we've all come to be in this situation today, where we're talking about reconciliation, where we're talking about the impact of those treaties, where we're talking about the impact of residential schools and day schools on our communities. And from a mental health perspective, when we talk about those adverse childhood experiences, when we're talking about the legacy of multi-generational day schools, residential schools, 60s scoop, the impact that has. And, when we talk about Just Get Over It, as Anjeni pointed out, that this is something that we as Indigenous people very often hear when we go through this activity where people are, on the one hand, we have statements where they're being asked to, tell us how you feel if this is happening to your family. So, if this was happening to your children and grandchildren, this is happening to your parents and grandparents. And that timeline is interspersed with interactive statements that people are being asked to engage with, and really using feeling words. We're not looking for analysis of down with the government or, critical theory stuff. We're asking people to use feelings, to explore, to put themselves, this is happening to them. This is happening to your children or your grandparent. And that changes the dynamic of this, instead of the sort of bash you over the head, as Anjeni was saying, shame and blame. We're all in this country together in various degrees of separation or relationship to First Nations, immigrants, early settlers, immigrants, refugees, people who have all come to live their lives now. And very many of us, even as Indigenous people, can't say that we're strongly on one side or the other of the settler and Indigenous dynamic. So how we explore that from a feeling perspective, from an empathy perspective, and understanding that none of us are responsible for what came before us to get us to this point. But what we are responsible for is, now that we know this story, now that we have been able to bear witness to the pain that colonization has caused, how we move forward together in a good way. And by creating empathy, by focusing on feelings, and not on blame, not on assigning blame in that way, we're able to help people understand. And as one gentleman said at the end of it, you know, we were talking about those 215, the 215, those original unmarked graves that were found. And he explained how, from his perspective, he finally understood why some people can never just get over it. Because he explained that he and his wife provide the before and after school care for their granddaughter. And he says, every day I give my granddaughter breakfast, and then we put on her little backpack and I walk her to the school. And I watch her go into the school with her kindergarten teacher. And he said, if she wasn't here at 3 o'clock when I came back to get her, I would never be able to live myself. I would never be able to face my daughter. I would never be able to live with myself for letting this happen to her. And he says, so I finally understand. He says, there's not enough whiskey in the world to drown that kind of pain. So I understand why people turn to what happens, why people can't just get over it, because there's some things you never just get over. So being able to put ourselves into that place of feeling, into that place of empathy, into understanding the wave after wave after wave of legislation that created this situation, creates a space where we can actually have a conversation about what that would feel like if that was happening to you, and how we all want to do something differently moving forward. And then we can explore what that looks like. So I think we can.
Yeah, so as Mimi was saying, it's very easy for folks to get lost in that history, to get lost in numbers and dates, and it's almost as if that information becomes separate from us as individuals. It's hard to connect to something when you're talking about, 150,000 children went to residential schools. Well, it's very easy to separate yourself from that. It's very easy to cut off that emotion. And so the way that we have built this exercise, yes, we talk about the information, we talk about the numbers, we create that timeline. As Mimi said, we do ask people throughout the exercise to engage with their feelings, but we also ask the facilitators, who are all Indigenous, to also sprinkle their own histories and stories into this exercise. So everything from folks whose grandparents have been enfranchised or been to residential school and the impact on that through the generations afterwards, to folks who've actually been to the day schools and faced that abuse and the physical effects that it's had on their body after living through that. You know, how do you move forward when you start your life with that pain? So we're not just talking about information that is separate from us. We're not telling other people's stories. As facilitators, as people leading this exercise, we're telling our own histories and we're telling our own stories. And so it's truth telling in a way that engages people through empathy, right? It's hard to separate yourself from that history when you see real people in front of you affected by that history. And so in understanding, that these topics are very heavy, and in sharing these stories, it is heavy for both participants and for us as facilitators, we always have a trained mental health support person with us when we lead these exercises. And so at any point throughout the exercise, if someone is feeling very teary, if they need to just step away for a bit, that's fine, they'll just let us know. But if someone needs to talk to someone, if they need to process those feelings, if they need a safe person to talk to, we always have someone with us to make sure that when we're engaging with these histories and these stories, that no one's feeling bad or guilty or shamed or triggered when they leave the exercise. We always want people to feel uplifted and safe when they engage with us in this exercise. And when we come to the end of the exercise, we take a pause and we allow people to debrief. We ask them some questions. What stood out to you about this history? And what are you going to do with this history now that you know it? Now that you've witnessed these stories, now that you've heard this history, now that you have this information, how are you going to move forward? And a lot of people will say, well, I'd like to learn more, but other people, they talk about how they're going to bring it into their classroom, how they're going to make sure that even if they're a non-Indigenous teacher, they always have a smudge bowl available for their students to use if they're Indigenous, or for the IT department, you know, not assuming that someone has a base level of knowledge about technology when there are Indigenous people who live in remote communities that never had access to those technologies. So, you know, various people from various professions are now thinking, oh, I've heard this history, I understand a little bit more. How can I change my thinking to engage better with Indigenous people? How can I make sure that I am moving forward in a way that supports and uplifts Indigenous people and brings them into the fold, rather than separating ourselves, you know, us versus them? Maybe I'll pass that along to you.
So thank you, Anjeni. And I think one of the things when you look at this, when we think, we have actual facilitators who have experienced, as Anjeni was saying, they are a survivor of the 60s scoop or the child welfare system. They're a survivor of a day school or a residential school or enfranchisement. Well, on the one hand, one might think, oh, well, you're deliberately seeking out people who have had this trauma to exploit them as part of your activity. And it's not that. In fact, this evolved very organically when we were developing this exercise. And each one of the facilitators realized at a certain point that that was my experience. That was my grandmother's or my mother's experience. That was my family's experience. And wanted to share that aspect. And we realized very quickly that because of intergenerational trauma, all of our facilitators, these things have impacted our lives in very important ways. And this is something, so it's not that we're seeking out those who have experienced this in order to exploit, it's that every Indigenous person on our team, every Indigenous person in every community has had this history impact them in certain ways. And so by being able to offer a perspective from their perspective, how maybe child welfare impacted their family specifically, we have also, begun to engage in that truth telling as part of a, giving voice, a part of feeling able, like we're able to do something, and being sure that, it is part of a healing process, as difficult as it is sometimes. And many of those who engage in this with us have pointed to the fact that having somebody who this impacted their life, somebody who has experienced this, how different that is from simply watching a movie. Or as Anjeni said, more statistics. Statistics are just numbers and they're easily sloughed off and forgotten about. But actually having to sit in the presence of somebody who attended a day school or who attended a residential school and is still living with that really gives people to understand that this was not ancient history, that this was not 200 years ago, that then, and very much, especially with child welfare, how sometimes this is still happening today. And I think that's what makes it different. That's what makes people able to truly understand and truly engage in a positive way, because it isn't just a story. It's not something that, even if they're documentaries, we can just turn off and walk away from, to actually realize that these people, that we have all shared this history and it is still having a continuing impact, makes a huge difference. And I think the other thing, when we talk about taking action, this is a critical part of this activity, because when we face the history of Canada, it's very easy to become paralyzed, very easy to become stuck in that place of shame, which can either lead to defensiveness, where we try to defend what happened in the past. Those people didn't know, they were well-intentioned, or that was a long time ago. Or we can look at this, accept and understand what happened, understand that we're not responsible for that, and find ways that, but we are responsible for dealing with the legacy that has been handed down to us. And so that's a critical part of this activity, is to make sure that people are not left sitting in that place of being paralyzed by history, but actually giving them some tools for how we move forward in a good way. Because as Anjeni was saying, and when we often, everybody says, well, I want to learn more. Okay, what can we do beyond that? How are we going to learn more, not just watch documentaries? And we go through steps, what are some good ways that you can engage? And I think one of the most critical things that Anjeni was pointing out is we do this activity with everybody from security, who are the people who are going to be walking into a residence if there's a student who is, having to call for a welfare check. We are engaging in doing this training with the cafeteria staff, who are the ones who see those students every morning, every lunch. They probably see them more than the faculty, but we also engage with faculty and leadership, who are the ones who are making the decisions that impact the educational experience that all of our students of all backgrounds are experiencing. And that's why having this training from every level of the institution and community. We've done this training with paramedics, police, fire, everybody who is going to be engaging. That's where we're making real systemic change, because they're going to have a greater understanding of why they might get a certain reaction, of why certain things, play out in specific ways in classrooms, in residences, at bars on a Friday night. And find that's the really critical part, is when we get together and we analyze, okay, what does this look like in your particular job? If you are in the social work school, what does this look like? If you are in the faculty of education, what does this look like in a classroom? When you have parents and you have, an easy to see one is when we have parent teacher night. And I remember in my own community, how many of the teachers would talk about how Indigenous parents don't care about their children's education. They're not engaged, they're not committed, because here's parent teacher night, and you could shoot a cannon down the hallway and not hit anybody because the hallways are empty. When you understand the trauma of a residential school or a day school experience, even potentially in that very building that you are now asking parents to come in and sit in that little kindergarten chair in a classroom in a building where they've experienced abuse, it's not that they don't care about their child's education, but the trauma that they experienced in those spaces, it completely overwhelms their ability to be able to enter those spaces again. So understanding how you engage in these kind of situations, maybe you engage at the community fall fair, maybe you engage at hockey night, maybe you have many schools that we do activities, we have parent teacher interaction stuff outside in the playground at a powwow and something that's culturally appropriate, and outside of the walls of the institution that caused that trauma. We can think outside, literally outside that box of the school, makes a huge difference in terms of building understanding and reconciliation and helping us grow together and support each other in that role, whether we're supporting children in the child welfare, whether we're supporting children in a classroom. We all have that focus, but previous to now maybe have not understood that, as one elder pointed out, maybe what you thought you heard was not what I thought I said. And how that cross communication so often leads to misunderstandings, leads to misinterpretations. And this is a really critical first step in helping people understand the ground that we're moving forward from.
Yeah, as Mimi had mentioned, we don't just engage with folks here on campus, but we often engage with community partners. Off the top of my head, between June of 2023 and today, we have trained or done this workshop with just shy of 1,000 people. I want to say it's about 965 or something close to that. And a lot of these folks are coming from church groups, they're coming from municipal offices, they're coming from mental health organizations and paramedics and, a lot of companies in the energy sector, folks all across the board. And what we have often done when engaging with these folks is shifted the focus or expanded the focus from this exercise beyond just this base history. When we talk with mental health organizations, we talk about, the history of social workers and why Indigenous people are so wary of that profession. We talk about, examples of the facilitators and their families engaging with social workers, or even our Indigenous student therapist here talks about, she took social work and she is in that profession, and how her family reacted to that. So we don't just share a bunch of information and process that, but we also cater it specifically to the audience that we're working with. So, in education, we talk a little bit more about the schools. In mental health, we dive in a little bit more into the social work aspect, into that. And we want folks to ask questions. We want folks to leave feeling supported in that. And so often folks will come back to us and say, you know, I really want to learn more about the 60s scoop specifically, or the Millennium Scoop, and how I, as a social worker, can engage better with my clients, or can engage in a safer way with the Indigenous folks who are coming through my door. How do I make that less harmful for them? How do I make that less triggering for them? And we've expanded this exercise into half-day sessions where we talk about the treaties in more depth, or we invite folks to look for Indigenous caterers who are local to them so that they can sit down together and connect with themselves and with us over traditional foods. So we're not just asking them to engage with us through this trauma and this terrible history, but to also engage with us in a way that builds connection, both with themselves and with us. And we invite folks to further that learning, both through information that we talk about after, you know, videos and articles that they can read, but we also offer additional sessions that build upon what we talk about in the Just Get Over It exercise. We talk about Two-Spirit history, and we delve into, you know, key figures throughout history that, you know, are Two-Spirit and have contributed very greatly to our communities who've been forgotten about. We talk about urban Indigenous experiences and how they differ quite greatly from Indigenous folks who grew up on reserve. We talk about Métis history through an additional Just Get Over It exercise that focuses just on the Métis and what they went through, because unfortunately, you know, a lot of folks will pan-Indigenize that history, and we talk about the history of Indigenous people in this nation, forgetting that the Métis people went through a different history, and it's just as terrible, but it is different from what a lot of First Nations went through. Same with the Inuit. We have another module that explores the Inuit history, right? And how residential schools for them differed from residential school experience for First Nations folks. And that differs from the Métis history, and that differs from, you know, urban Indigenous people. So we try to delve into specific histories so that folks aren't just pan-Indigenizing and saying, you know, here's settlers and here's Indigenous people. There were hundreds of Indigenous nations across this continent. There were, you know, a lot of different histories that intersected. And so we want folks to explore that a little bit more. And Mimi, I'll pass that over to you.
Thanks you, Anjeni. And I think this is one of the things, as Anjeni was pointing out, that our initial Just Get Over It is essentially like a level 1. It's an introduction. And when we started to want to think, well, we need to have more Métis content because it can't be just a couple of paragraphs in this activity, more Inuit experience, we realized that you can't add all of those really vital, unique experiences into one story, because all of a sudden it became a 4-hour-long activity, which nobody is going to be able to engage with. So we realized that a much better approach was to have our initial introductory activity. And so these ones become basically a level 2, that once you've had that initial high level, you know, colonization for dummies, kind of Cole's Notes version, we then move into the level 2, which is, you know, the specific streams of unique experiences within that context. And there is one more where we're looking at the situation, the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women is also one of our workshops. And then, so having this ability to engage at that next level, you know, provides a more in-depth opportunity to understand those unique experiences without just trivializing them by having it be, you know, a couple of lines and, okay, now we've mentioned the Métis and now we're moving right along. So you're really being able to engage in that way.
And in offering these exercises, we often invite the department or the organization to donate an amount rather than charge them a specific amount. And that money goes directly back to students, right? If we think about all of the costs that Indigenous students have to face, right? A campus parking pass for the academic year, for $425. Textbooks and supplies for their schooling, this is just an average amount, but based on the program, you know, science textbooks, those are $200-300 a piece, and they often have multiple textbooks for every class. So that starts adding up. The monthly cost of groceries, I'm not even sure that's an accurate number anymore because it keeps climbing, right? And a lot of these students who aren't living in residence or don't have a meal plan, right? Now they have to buy groceries for themselves, and they have to find the transportation to get to those groceries. They have, you know, rent to pay each month. And for young folks, it's really hard to pay that. And so we want to make sure that, you know, yes, we're doing these exercises to help you know, teach this history and allow folks to learn how to engage with Indigenous people, but we also still want to be directly supporting our Indigenous students who are coming through the university.
So I think the beauty of this, as Anjeni was pointing out, is after having gone through the history of colonization, after understanding how being, you know, corralled into these tiny little spaces, the impact that this has on socioeconomics, when we have this new generation, you know, many young Indigenous people who are trying to make a difference in the lives of their families and communities by achieving an education so that they can provide for their families, so that they can, you know, give back to their communities. But sometimes it's the cost difference is huge, and you know, we know funding is a challenge. We know that it's a challenge for international students, it's a challenge for domestic students, and it's a challenge for First Nation students. As much as, I mean, I would love to be able to do this for every student, but you know, I do have my little lane that I'm supposed to stay in. And one of the things that's really this allows us to do is that once people have had their eyes opened, and if, for example, it's Ontario Power Generation that's doing this training, when we explain, if there's 400 of you in this meeting, if each of you gave $10, you know, your lunch was paid for today, you didn't have to buy it. If you gave that $10, that would be $4,000. That would allow me to provide a student a job for the year. 4 weeks of wages for a summer student employee. That would allow me to pay for a summer student for 2 months. So 2 workshops where people, so if they gave $20 each, that would allow a student a job, the ability to sustain themselves, the ability to make a huge difference in the life of their family and of their community. That's real impact that we're seeing moving forward. And that allows that kind of empowerment, that allows real systemic change. And we can all be part of that and doing things in a really good way.
So we wanted to thank you all for listening today. We will open it up for questions in just a moment, but I wanted to point out that if anyone is interested in learning more about the exercise and asking us some questions, I do have my contact info on the bottom left of the screen. So that's my phone number, as well as the email that you can reach out to. Yeah, thank you very much for listening today.
Thank you so much. If folks have any questions, you're welcome to put it in our question and answer section. In the meantime, I also want to introduce my colleague, Megan. Unfortunately, because of some technical issue, Megan was in the participant list instead of our panelist section. So Megan, if you'd like to introduce yourself and also talk about some of the work you're doing.
Thanks, Taryn. Good morning, everyone. First, I would like to say thank you, Nyawa and Miigwech, for Anjeni and Don for your lovely words and a really great and inspiring presentation this morning. So my name is Megan Benevry. I am Seneca Nation Turtle Clan from Six Nations, and my role at CICMH is the Indigenous Knowledge Research Lead here. And so the work that I'm going to be doing is just continuing from our Indigenous post-secondary research needs assessment that was conducted last year. So I'm in the process of creating a info sheet on that needs assessment. And basically that would be like a very high level summary of those findings. So hopefully maybe by springtime, we might be able to upload a info sheet on that. But yeah, and I'll turn it over to you, Taryn.
Thanks so much, Megan. Thank you, everybody, for coming in today. Thank you to our panelists. I do want to let you know that our next webinar will be on February 16th on clinical supervision. If you'd like to know more about the webinar, you're welcome to check it out on our website. I'm going to put the website link in the chat for you to access. Oh, there are some questions. Okay, we have some questions. This is great. So we have one question. Are you moving this program into any corporate spaces?
Yes, so we have worked with corporations before, a lot of folks in the energy sector, but I think another big one that off the top of my head is like Boston Consulting. So we've worked with various corporations before, for sure.
And we did actually do one with CAMH. I think the directors of each CAMH institution, they were across the whole country, had come to their annual meeting in Toronto. So from everything, yeah, CMHA, thank you. Yeah, CAMH is one institution within, apologies. It's all C, M's, and H's and A's together. But looking at, because each of those people has impact in their own region that has very wide-reaching impact when we work with those. Hydro One, as you said, energy sector, and private and municipalities. The municipality of Clarington and Oshawa have trained everybody from their parking staff through right up to the local, I want to say board of governors, but that's not what municipalities have. Whatever municipalities have in that role, municipal mayor and all of them.
We have a question in the chat asking if folks missed it, but how long is the workshop?
So typically about 2 hours is what I would say is the ideal length. Again, if there are extra pieces that we add, like talking a bit more about the treaties or including a meal, that will expand the time, but generally 2 hours.
And I think based on one of the other questions here, is there an opportunity, is it online? It was actually originally designed for online. We have only just recently moved it to the ability to have it in person and online. You can certainly contact Anjeni if your particular group here would like to have one, or if we wanted to join one of the ones that we're having. Sometimes we do allow others to sit in, as they said, so that you can experience it, so that you can vouch for it. Being a positive experience, absolutely. And I think for the other question about working with a mental health agency, I think going through this activity is a really good first step in terms of how to create safer spaces. Going through this activity allows for some understanding of the context you would be working in, and then being able to sit down together and work through what that looks like in practical, concrete steps in your specific space. But I do recommend actually engaging with staff in this activity and then being able to move forward. I found, especially with security and facility staff here at the university, it was really powerful to have this activity first and then sit down and come up with some safe steps, how we're going to change behaviors, how we're going to change structures and policies and processes to make it a safer environment.
Thank you, Dawn. I have another question here in the chat. I work with a French community health center. Is this workshop available in French?
Not yet, but good point. I think that would be an excellent, I was literally just writing down some ideas for the sort of third level, but thank you for that. I think that would be a great idea and something we will certainly work on.
We have another question. I'm not from Trent, so I haven't been to your program, but I think it sounds wonderful. From an organization perspective, is this based on orientation to all staff? We get the same folks interested in learning more. Any suggestion on reaching the frontline staff who would need it? Love the IT examples. So true.
So one of the things here at Trent, we are working on having this be mandatory for all new staff coming in. because that's easier to do. Trying to get some of the old boys in the faculty unions to admit that they should have some new learning is a bit longer struggle. But that's one of the beauty of us engaging with at the Board of Governors leadership level, was to get them to see how important this is and then start having those. But we have seen examples of organizations that have said that all of their frontline staff need to have this activity. We had the O-week leaders, all of the dons, all of the O-week leaders. It tends to be more of a new staff coming in because it's easier to implement. It's a little harder to grandfather. And as you said, because unfortunately, yes, always it's the people who probably don't need it that always sign up, and the ones who do need it, it's a little, but we have here at the institution had entire departments say that this is mandatory. And I think once their leader has done that, because it's not a shame and blame, bash you over the head kind of activity, we have yet to have somebody who's come out of it saying that this was awful and they don't recommend it. In fact, every single one of them has come out and said that even though it was difficult, it was really meaningful and in fact, very eye-opening and empowering. I think the only one time we had some pushback was we did it with the local diocese. So it was, you can imagine for those, that was a challenging one, but even then there was only one or two. So
Yeah. And yeah, in working with folks, I mean, here at Trent, HR actually has a program here called the Student Support Certificate. So all of the different student support departments here on campus will offer up a training that any staff on campus can then sign up for. And so every semester we offer it to, you know, any staff member who is in that student support role, you know, whether they're in the counseling center or student accessibility services, student affairs, so the folks who are engaging directly with students and their issues, anybody from any of these departments, even if their department specifically has not asked for the training, they can still sign on for that learning.
Thank you. I do have a couple of questions specifically regarding the webinars. The webinar recording will be on our website. Again, within that link that I put on the chat about around 10:45. And while we have our webinar set for next month, we don't have anything confirmed for the following months, but you can find out if you follow us on our social media or if you sign up on our newsletters, and you can do that through our website as well. We have a couple more questions and then maybe we'll end it off there. Is this being done in any other post-secondary institutions?
So we have not offered this to any other post-secondary institutions, and apart from the Kairos blanket exercise, which isn't specific to post-secondary, you know, there's not a lot of folks doing this kind of workshop out there.
and only because we haven't been asked. We're not adverse to offering it to other institutions, and or even one of the things we're looking at is if it is in another region, the importance of those stories that are shared during the activity being from local people. So working with local elders as facilitators so that it is local stories and local context.
Amazing. And I do have a couple of comments and then we'll end it off from there. Somebody said, thank you so much for sharing invaluable experience and information and for making it practical. Somebody else said, I'm sorry I joined late. I would be interested in participating as I am on our EDIA committee and would like to bring it to our institution. So as Anjeni pointed out, the contact information is on the slides. I did add it to the chat as well earlier. I can add it again so folks can access it. And thank you, folks. And again, reminder that you can access the recording by end of day today, and you can also access our archive, which all of our webinars in our past have been recorded. So you're welcome to check those out. And again, thank you so much, Dawn and Anjeni. This has been a very great, lovely experience, and I'm sure folks are very, very grateful.
Oh, and I just want to remind everybody, we have our elders gathering here at Trent on February 9th, 10th, and 11th, which is coming up. If you do go to that FPHL Trent University website, there is a link. Tickets are free for students, and we really encourage everybody to come and potentially have an opportunity to hear from elders. We're learning how to make smoked fish, put up a teepee, There's some other really fabulous activities, and I strongly encourage everybody who has the ability to sign up for either virtual or in person. It's open to everybody.
Amazing. Thanks for sharing that, Dawn. Okay, well, I hope you folks have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week.
You're very welcome. Take care.
Thank you so much.